The Grand Hall of the United Nations was filled with an air of anticipation. Representatives from every country sat in their assigned seats, murmuring amongst themselves, speculating about the mysterious announcement that had been teased for weeks. Journalists and media personnel were stationed at every corner, cameras flashing as they prepared to capture history in the making. At exactly 8 p.m., the lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the room. A single spotlight illuminated the grand stage, and from the shadows emerged a tall, lean figure in a dark suit. His presence commanded attention, and a wave of unease rippled through the audience as they recognized the man standing before them. It was Dr. Elias Carter, a former government scientist turned whistleblower. He had vanished from the public eye years ago after exposing classified projects that many claimed were mere conspiracy theories. His return was unexpected, and his expression was grim, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He stepped forward, adjusting the microphone, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, in a voice that sent chills down the spines of those present, he began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, leaders of the world, citizens of every nation, I stand before you today to reveal truths that have been hidden for far too long. What I am about to say may shock you, anger you, and perhaps even terrify you. But it is time the world knew the reality we have been living in. A murmur spread through the crowd, but Elias raised a hand, silencing them. For decades, we have believed that the greatest threats to our world were war, famine, and disease. While these are indeed devastating, they pale in comparison to the real danger, one that has been carefully concealed from the public eye. It is not a country, a government, or a terrorist organization. It is something far more insidious. He paused, looking over the sea of faces, watching as doubt and fear took root. Our planet, our very existence, has been under control, not by our leaders, not by corporations, but by an intelligence that does not originate from Earth. I am not speaking of science fiction. I am speaking of a truth that has been buried beneath layers of deception. Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the hall. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others leaned in, eager for more. The media scrambled to capture every word, their hands trembling as they recorded history in the making. You may ask, why now? Why am I revealing this today? The answer is simple. Because time is running out. Elias reached into his pocket and retrieved a small device, pressing a button. A large screen behind him flickered to life, displaying satellite images, classified documents, and recordings that had never been seen by the public. For years, governments across the globe have been aware of unidentified aerial phenomena. These are not mere unidentified flying objects. They are surveillance mechanisms. The beings behind them have been observing us, studying us, and manipulating us. Many of the global conflicts we have endured were not of our own making. They were orchestrated. The chaos, the division, the wars, the economic collapses, all designed to keep humanity distracted, fighting amongst ourselves, so that we would not see the real enemy. The room erupted into chaos. Some delegates rose from their seats, shouting in protest. Others sat frozen, their faces pale. The security personnel shifted uncomfortably, waiting for orders. Elias continued, undeterred. I have spent years in hiding, collecting evidence, and seeking the truth. The world governments, or at least those in power, have known this for decades. They have made deals, exchanging information, resources, and even human lives to maintain the illusion of control. But the illusion is crumbling. The presence of these beings is no longer subtle. They have infiltrated our systems, our structures, and soon they will no longer need to hide. A journalist in the front row stood up. "Are you saying that there are extraterrestrials living among us?" Elias locked eyes with her. "Yes, not only living among us but controlling key positions of power. They have shaped the course of history, deciding which nations rise and which fall. They have decided when wars begin and when they end. They are not invaders from the sky. They have been here long before us. And now, their plans are reaching their final stage." The room exploded into chaos. Some accused Elias of spreading fear-mongering lies, while others demanded to see more evidence. Leaders whispered among themselves, some already making phone calls. Elias raised his voice. "I understand your skepticism, but denial will not save us. I am not here to create panic. I am here to warn you. There is still a chance to fight back, but only if we unite, only if we put aside our petty conflicts and see the bigger picture. If we continue to be divided, we will fall not to war, but to forces beyond our comprehension." At that moment, the lights flickered. The screen behind Elias glitched, and the audio system screeched with static. The security personnel rushed toward the stage, but before they could reach him, the entire room plunged into darkness. A single voice echoed through the hall, deep and unnatural. He was not supposed to speak. And then the power came back on. Elias was gone. The microphone lay on the floor, still buzzing with static. The screen behind him now displayed a simple message. Panic spread like wildfire. Some delegates rushed for the exits, but the heavy wooden doors of the United Nations Assembly Hall remained sealed. Security officers barked orders into their radios, but their earpieces only crackled with dead silence. The power had returned, but something was different. A chilling realization crept over the room. Elias Carter was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. The journalists, sensing the magnitude of the moment, continued recording, their hands shaking. The screens around the hall, which had flickered back to life, now cycled through distorted images, grainy footage of unknown flying objects, intercepted transmissions in an unrecognizable language, classified documents stamped with the seals of world governments. A trembling delegate from France stood. "We must shut this down! This is an attack! Cut the power!" But no one was listening. The voice, the deep, unnatural voice that had echoed in the darkness, still lingered in their minds. He was not supposed to speak. Then the screens changed again. A face appeared. A face that was almost human, but disturbingly off. The eyes were too large, the skin eerily smooth, the expression too still. It blinked slowly, as if studying the audience. "You have been warned." And then, silence. The room stood in shock, as if the entire world had collectively stopped breathing. Then, chaos erupted. Phones buzzed wildly as leaders and officials received incoming messages. Reports flooded in. Outages in major cities, unusual sky activity, mass internet blackouts. Social media was ablaze with theories and fear. Had Elias been telling the truth? Had the moment finally come? A U.S. official turned to his aide. "Get the president on the line, now." In London, the Prime Minister's war room was already active. In Beijing, a classified meeting was underway. Moscow, Paris, New Delhi, every major government was suddenly mobilizing. And then, the first real-world event hit. At exactly 8:45 p.m., just minutes after Elias's disappearance, the International Space Station sent out a distress signal. Unidentified craft detected. Multiple signatures. This is not a drill. The signal cut out. 3 minutes later, global satellite feeds captured something unprecedented. Lights in the upper atmosphere, forming patterns no natural phenomenon could explain. The world had spent decades arguing about the existence of life beyond Earth. Now the argument was over. A journalist, still broadcasting live from the UN hall, gripped her microphone, her voice unsteady. "This is not science fiction, this is real. Something is happening. The world has changed tonight." The night sky, once a serene abyss of stars, now swirled with unnatural movement. Cities across the globe reported the same phenomenon, streaks of light cutting through the clouds, shifting in deliberate formations. Satellite feeds confirmed the impossible. Unidentified objects entering Earth's atmosphere in synchronized descent. Governments scrambled to respond. Fighter jets were deployed. Emergency broadcasts interrupted every television channel. The world had lived under the illusion of control, but now that illusion was shattering. Inside the United Nations Assembly Hall, fear gripped every soul. The security doors, once locked, suddenly clicked open. A delegate from Germany gasped. "They're letting us go?" A U.S. general turned to his team. "No, they're done watching." The delegates flooded out into the streets of New York, where the air buzzed with an eerie stillness. The usual hum of traffic had been replaced by an anxious silence. Citizens stared, up, pointing at the sky where strange, pulsating lights hovered. No sirens, no announcements, just an unnatural quiet. Then, at exactly 9 p.m., a sound rang out. Not from the skies, but from deep within the earth itself. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the ground, rattling windows and making people clutch their ears. In cities across the world, buildings trembled, bridges swayed, and power grids flickered. Animals howled and fled. Something was waking up. In Washington, D.C., the president stood in the White House bunker, watching satellite footage with military leaders. The screen showed a chilling sight. Ancient structures buried beneath the Earth's surface were shifting, revealing mechanisms that had remained dormant for millennia. The locations matched ancient sites: Stonehenge, the pyramids of Giza, the Nazca lines. An advisor whispered, "My God. They were never monuments. They were warnings." Then the first explosion hit. A massive energy pulse erupted from beneath. The Pacific Ocean. Tsunami sirens blared as an unknown force surged upward, shattering water like glass. In the following seconds, similar pulses activated in locations around the world, sending shockwaves through military bases, power plants, and major cities. The invasion had begun, not from the skies, but from within. At the UN building, the remaining delegates and journalists ran for cover as the ground beneath them cracked. Elias Carter's warning now rang louder than ever. He had spoken the truth. Humanity was never in control. The first rupture split the streets of New York apart, sending cars tumbling into the abyss. A deafening roar echoed as something massive and ancient began rising from beneath the city. Across the world, similar events unfolded, cracks in the earth revealing structures, machinery, and entities that had been buried for centuries, perhaps millennia. People screamed and ran as an enormous metallic monolith emerged in the center of Times Square. Its surface pulsed with an otherworldly energy, glowing symbols flickering across its surface. The air vibrated with a deep, resonant hum. In Washington, the president's war room was chaos. Military generals shouted orders, analysts scrambled for information, but the truth was inescapable. This was beyond human technology. Every missile strike, every drone attack, every desperate act of defense proved useless. The monoliths were impervious to all weapons. Then, at exactly 9:30 p.m., the sky darkened unnaturally, as if the stars themselves were being swallowed. The massive structures finished their emergence, standing like silent sentinels in every major city. Then they spoke. The voice was not in any one language, but in all of them at once, vibrating inside the skulls of every living being on the planet. Your time is over. The words sent shockwaves through humanity's collective consciousness. People fell to their knees, clutching their heads. Some screamed, some wept, others stood in silent horror. Inside the United Nations Assembly, Hall, a young journalist still recording, whispered into her microphone, "This isn't an invasion, it's a reckoning." The screen behind her flickered again, displaying a chilling message in every language. "We have been here before. We will be here again. The cycle continues." Elias Carter had tried to warn them. Humanity was never alone. It had always been watched, guided, controlled. Civilizations before had risen and fallen under their gaze, and now it was happening again. The sky above shifted, revealing enormous vessels descending, blocking out the moon. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to reclaim what had always been theirs. As the first tendrils of energy lashed out from the monoliths, disintegrating everything in their path, humanity finally understood. This was not an invasion. Across the world, chaos erupted. Cities burned. The sky turned an unnatural shade of black, and the ground trembled as if the earth itself was rebelling. The massive vessels in the sky hovered silently, their mere presence overwhelming the planet's defenses. The monoliths that had risen from beneath the ground began pulsing rhythmically, sending out waves of energy that disoriented people, shut down power grids, and rendered all weapons useless. Nations that had spent centuries amassing nuclear arsenals and military might found themselves powerless. The rules of war no longer applied. This was something beyond human comprehension. Then came the first strike. A blinding beam of light shot down from one of the hovering ships, striking a city in an instant. Where skyscrapers once stood, only a smoldering crater remained. Millions were erased as if they had never existed. The attack was precise, calculated. This was not indiscriminate destruction. It was a warning. In the White House bunker, the 𝐈𝐆𝐍𝐻𝐃 president stood frozen, watching live feeds from satellites. Every major world leader had joined an emergency conference call, but no one had a plan. They had all received the same message. This is not your world. It never was. Elias Carter had vanished, but his warning still echoed in their minds. In New York, amidst the wreckage and screaming, a small group of survivors huddled in the ruins of the United Nations building. Among them was the journalist who had broadcast Elias's speech to the world. She clutched her camera, still streaming despite the destruction around her. In New York, amidst the wreckage and screaming, a small group of survivors huddled in the ruins of the United Nations building. Among them was the journalist who had broadcast Elias's speech to the world. She clutched her camera, still streaming, despite the destruction around her. "We are still here," she whispered into the microphone. her voice raw with fear. "If anyone can hear this, humanity is still here." A figure stepped out of the shadows. A man in a tattered suit. Blood on his face. It was Elias Carter. "They made their move," he said grimly. "Now it's time to make ours." The survivors stared at him in disbelief. "You knew this was coming. How do we stop it?" Elias exhaled, looking up at the sky where the massive ships loomed like gods above a dying world. "We don't stop it," he said. "We survive it." At that moment, a second beam of light descended, striking another city. The cycle had begun, and humanity's final fight was about to begin. The world was collapsing. Cities crumbled, skies burned, and entire nations fell silent as the monoliths continued their slow, methodical purge. Humanity, once the dominant force on Earth, now stood at the mercy of something far older, far greater. In the ruins of New York, Elias Carter led the small band of survivors through the shattered streets. Fires raged around them, casting eerie shadows against the towering monolith in the distance. The journalist, still gripping her camera, followed closely behind him. Without another word, Elias activated the orbs. The chamber trembled as a surge of light filled the room, and the orbs shifted, aligning themselves above their heads. The air seemed to ripple with an unnatural force, as they each felt an invisible pull, as if the very atmosphere around them was alive. The orbs seemed to respond to their presence, glowing brighter. One by one, the group stepped forward, each of them placing a hand on the floating orbs. The light intensified as they made contact, and they felt a jolt of energy surge through their bodies. It was unlike anything they had ever experienced, both excruciating and exhilarating at the same time. They were connected to something far beyond human understanding, and it was clear that the price of this connection might be far greater than they had anticipated. As the light enveloped them, Elias's voice echoed through their minds. "This is it. Hold on. We're going to need everything we've got to finish this." Above them, the monoliths in the city began to pulse with renewed energy. A deep, resonating hum reverberated through the earth as the ships above descended lower, casting an ominous shadow over the survivors. The aliens were preparing for something, an irreversible moment in history. In the distance, the journalist still held her camera, filming every moment. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the fight for humanity's survival." The ground shook violently. A massive force erupted from the monoliths as beams of energy shot out of their peaks, piercing the skies. And then it happened. The energy from the orbs, now fully activated, was directed back into the heart of the monoliths. A blinding light engulfed the city, and a deafening roar echoed from the very core of the earth. The world stood still, bathed in the blinding light that poured from the monoliths, the orbs, and the very earth itself. Time seemed to stretch, hanging in the balance, as humanity's last hope surged through the network they had unwittingly connected to. The air was thick with the hum of the ancient technology, vibrating through every fiber of their being. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the light began to fade. The ground stopped shaking. The roar of destruction quieted. The massive ships hovering above the cities remained still, their once intimidating presence now eerily silent. Elias Carter opened his eyes, his body drenched in sweat, and pulled his hand from the orb. The others followed suit, each of them trembling from the immense energy they had channeled. But it was not just exhaustion they felt, it was relief. For a moment, it seemed as though nothing had changed. The devastation outside still smoldered, the sky still darkened by the alien vessels. But deep within the heart of the monoliths, something had shifted. The energy that had once been destructive was now redirected, contained. The monoliths, once towering harbingers of annihilation, now hummed with a new subdued rhythm. Their lights flickered once more, but this time they were not signaling destruction. They were signaling something else. The figure of Elias, still standing at the center of the chamber, turned slowly to face the survivors. His expression was exhausted but triumphant. "It's done," he said softly. "We've bought ourselves time." Outside, the alien ships began to ascend, slowly at first, as if reconsidering their course. The beams of light that had once rained down in rapid succession were now retracting. The monoliths began to retract their energy, slowly becoming dormant once again. Humanity had not won. The fight was not over, but it had been given a chance. The ancient beings, who had watched over Earth for eons, had been momentarily stilled, their plans interrupted. Perhaps they would return. Perhaps they would finish what they had started. But for now, the world was safe. For now, humanity stood at the precipice, breathing a collective sigh of relief, knowing that this was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The survivors, those who had stood at the center of it, all turned to look at one another, the weight of their actions settling over them. They were no longer just witnesses to the end of the world. They were now the beginning of its new story. The journalist, still holding her camera, looked out at the horizon. "This is only the beginning," she murmured, the weight of the moment heavy in her words. As the camera panned across the scene, the world, burned, broken, yet alive, came into focus. The ruins of the great cities were now marked by hope. The monoliths stood dormant, but their mystery would remain, echoing through the ages. Humanity had survived, but the reckoning had only just begun. And somewhere, deep in the stars, something watched. Something ancient, something that knew that sooner or later the cycle would continue.